Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I will be painting this warm sunset scene. This was based off a view I saw on my trip to Athens last year, and I just love the simplicity of the composition and the values of this picture. I wasn't sure how to approach it all this time, especially for the backlighting on the plants, but since I've been practicing with the loose style scenes, I felt like I found a way to break it down. It's not perfect by all means, but I learned so much from this painting and I hope you feel the same. Here I've started out by sketching and mapping out the sections, starting with a tree and lines to divide up the planes, and I'm also going to draw the position of the sun very lightly. Next, let's go over the colors I'll be using. Firstly, this is Terre Verte by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, Compost Blue by Holbein, Indigo by Schmincke, and Ultramarine Finest by Schmincke. I'm also going to use Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. To create the backlight effect, I'm going to use my masking fluid. This is by Marie's, and I'm going to apply it using my silicone brush. Let's apply the masking fluid. I like to take some out of the bottle and just put it on a piece of paper where I can dip my silicone brush for easy application. I love this masking fluid because it's very light and easy to apply, and it has also lasted me the longest without it hardening on its own. So here I just made ovals, some upright and some slightly slanted in the foreground. I'm actually making things up instead of following the reference for every position, so I don't overcrowd them. And I'm placing them in uneven bunches instead of spreading the ovals out evenly. I want the ovals to be larger in the foreground and smaller as it gets further back. You can wait for the masking fluid to completely dry, but while I wait, I'm actually just going to paint the sky. Just be very mindful to not rest your hands down or you might smudge the masking fluid. I started by dampening the surface of the sky while avoiding the circle for the sun, and while I'm doing this, I want to be mindful of the edges since it's not masked around the sides. For the color, here I used a mix of Compost Blue and Ultramarine Finest at the top, but I actually didn't like it at the end, and I would prefer to just stick with Compost Blue because it's a warmer tone and it suits the painting a little bit better. I just placed the blue at the top and I just let the water kind of help it spread out. Then in the middle, I used a mix of Permanent Yellow Deep with Jaune Brilliant Dark. I applied a thick consistency and then I used extra water to help it move. Then at the bottom, I'm using the same mix with added vermilion for a warmer tone. I applied it right at the bottom on top of the mountain. Then again, I'm going to help it move with extra water and a damp brush. Under this orange, I'm going to paint the mountain, and for this I'm using Ultramarine Finest on the right side. Then as I get closer to the sun, I'm going to add some vermilion for some warmth. I felt like the color was running a bit too much though, and it was too wet, so I took off the excess and dried it off with a hairdryer. I just dried it off enough so the blue won't travel upwards into the orange, but it's not completely dry because I'm just going to wait for it to dry and move on to the dark greeneries in front. I want the color to be cooler on the side and warmer as it's closer to the sun. This is from a mix of Terre Verte, Indigo, and Vermilion. And as you can see, there is less vermilion on the right hand side versus what's directly underneath the sun. Using the same mix, I've added a bit of yellow to paint the left side. Next, I'm going to work on the tree. I've added more Terre Verte and Indigo. I'm going to use a very thick consistency to paint the bottom part of the tree, which will be the darkest. I placed the darkest value on the inside of the tree. Then going to the left, I added more Terre Verte in the mix, but I'm still not painting right to the edge yet. On the right hand side, you can see from the reference that the sun is almost directly hitting the side of the tree. So I've decided to use this really warm red. This is from Vermilion, Jaune Brilliant, and Permanent Yellow Deep, and I used a very thick consistency to paint the edges. Now going back to the left side, I'm reusing the Terre Verte mixture, but this time my brush has a bit of that vermilion left in it, so the color is a little bit more muted. This time I'm also using a medium consistency, so even if the colors are fairly similar, the outer part is lighter compared to the inside of the tree. Considering how thick the indigo was, I decided to add some water at the bottom, which will push out the paint and give it this nice texture. Then at the bottom, I'm going to continue to paint the shadow casted from the tree down to the grassy patch. I'm looking at the reference and I try to look where the darkest part of the patch is and when the color starts to change. And then I'll just adjust the mixture according to this. For the lighter patch of grass, I use a mix of Jaune Brilliant Dark, Permanent Yellow Deep, Vermilion, and the tiniest bit of Terre Verte. On the left is a little bit more yellow, but on the right I decided to use a bit more Terre Verte in the mix. Since the top part of the patch is getting more sun exposure, I use the orangey yellow mix. Then as I get closer to the bottom, the color gets a little darker, which is why I added some Terre Verte, and I'm going to follow this up with a dark green. As you can see from the reference image, the grass itself is quite tall, and this darker green will help to suggest that height. Here I'm adding the sun rays, but I'll just get into that a bit later. This is just to remind myself to not forget to add these on. I'm finally ready to paint the mountain in the background. This blue is from a mixture of composed blue and ultramarine finest, and as I mentioned earlier, I want to add more vermilion directly underneath the sun and more blue on the side. Directly underneath the mountain is actually the city of Athens, and I'm going to lightly paint the base color using the blue mixture with a lot of water in the mix. I've also switched to my dagger brush because I want this part to look textured in order to suggest some abstract details later on. To paint on some of the details, I want to make sure that the base is completely dry. Then I use the same mix with added indigo, and I'm going to add some textured lines using the side of my dagger brush. Just like the mountains, I'm going to add some vermilion in the mix as I get closer to the sun, and since this part is quite reflective as well, I also use some yellow. Now that I've painted the top half, I feel like I can add a bit more of the white flowers. I want these flowers to somewhat show up on the edge of the green on this front section, which is why I'm adding more along the side of the path. After this, I want the masking fluid to dry because I'm going to paint over it. I'm going to start from the bottom of the composition, and I'm using a mix of Terre Verte, indigo, and vermilion. I want the bottom to be dark, so this mixture should look like a dark grayish green. And I'm going to mix it up with some water for some wet on wet effect. And I'm going to build the color little by little, just like how I painted the green patch on top. Since we can see the soil closer to us, I use the darker values. And I'm going to use more of the yellow, green, and oranges for the top of the grass, as they are a bit more dense and closer together at the back. I'm working section by section, but I'm also doing this fairly quickly because I want the colors to have a soft blend with each other. This means that I don't want to wait for the paint to dry before adding the different tones, and the wet surface will just help blend it and move the paint along. The last thing to paint here is just the pathway. For this, I used the blue mixtures with indigo and added vermilion, and I just use a medium consistency. The field in front is still a little bit damp, and I feel like I can break up the spacing a little bit more with darker values, which is what I'm doing here. I'm fairly happy with the depth I've made here. So next I'm going to work on the second layer, and I want to make sure that everything's completely dry first. After everything's completely dry, I want to add more warmth to the overall composition, so I'm just going to glaze certain areas with more vermilion. Once I'm done, I'm going to dry it off so I can still work on a dry surface. I'm going to build on the contrast in value. I've basically placed the darker values already, but I want to darken it further, and I also want to add a bit of texture. This tree is the darkest area of the composition, so I'm going to layer on more of the dark greens, but I want to make sure that I don't paint over all of the wet on wet texture that I've created from the first layer, because I feel like it gives so much character. Here I've switched to my dagger brush to add some finer edges of the tree. I didn't end up liking it though, so I'm going to actually take it off. I feel like I couldn't match the intensity of the color, and I didn't really like the texture that I've created, but maybe it'll work a bit better with a smaller round brush instead of a dagger brush. I'm going to redefine the edge of the tree here, and after this I'm going to take off the masking fluid once everything is completely dry. It's really important that the paper is completely bone dry because it does take quite a bit of force for me to rub the masking fluid off, so if there are any damp patches you might end up ripping the paper instead. I'm going to add a bit of bleed-proof white using my dagger brush since there's a lot of light reflections from the sun. Now let's work on the fluffy flowers. I'm going to soften the color because the white is too bright compared to everything else. So what I want to do here is to smudge a little bit of color using the surrounding area. With a damp brush, I'm essentially reactivating the pigment that is already on the paper, and I'm pulling that bit of pigment to cover the white of the flowers. As you can see now, the flowers are an off-white instead of a pure white from the paper. But now I also have a slightly damp surface that I can take advantage of to create the backlight effect. For this, I'm using a really muddy color. I've already mixed up a lot of colors on my palette, so I just pick whatever that will make a warm gray. With this warm gray, I'm going to paint a dot at the bottom of all the ovals, and I'm going to let the damp surface kind of push the paint towards the top. While doing this, I also want to leave out a bit of space in the surrounding area, so it looks like there's a slight outline from the lighter color. What I'm doing now is optional, but sometimes I like to enhance the outer glow with extra bleed-proof white around the edges. Looking at the composition as a whole, I feel like these flowers are not warm enough compared to the grass and everything else in this composition, so I decided to add extra warmth by layering a really light consistency of vermilion over the dark parts of these flowers. After this, I'm going to add some stem details. I'm not going to do this for every single one, but for the color, I'm going to use this muted light yellow color with the addition of bleed-proof white. in a thick consistency. This way the color is opaque against the dark background. And I've also switched to my smaller brush. This way I can paint really thin, delicate lines. I feel like it looks a bit odd if they're just random flowers popping out from the ground, so I'm going to add some additional leaf textures. I'm just using a grayish green in a medium consistency, so it will still dry transparent against everything else. I also like to add some grassy textures. Then at the top, I feel like it's looking quite empty, so I decided to add some more dots to suggest more flowers in the background, especially along the edges of the field in front. While I'm still working with the bleed-proof white, I'm going to add some at the bottom of the tree to suggest some light going through some of the branches. And I'm also going to add some around the edges, and this will just help with the tree to look more airy and less dense. At this point, the blue sky was bothering me because the blue is so cool compared to everything else on paper. So I tried to add a bit of warmth with Jaune Brilliant Dark, just giving it a light glaze. I think it helped a little bit, but because of this extra layer and because I was a bit too heavy-handed with the blue on the first layer, I feel like the sky looks too dark and heavy. So please use compost blue instead for the blue sky and use a lighter consistency at the beginning of this painting. I feel like I have a pretty good amount of detail, so next I'm going to paint, or I guess lift in the sun rays. I'm using a clean damp brush with my size 0 brush, and with the clean water I'm basically just reactivating the paint and then lifting the extra paint that I've reactivated using tissue. I'm basically done, but I'm going to balance and increase the darker values for the whole composition, especially for these corners in the foreground, so the larger flowers doesn't look like they're floating, but more like they're hidden behind some tall grass in front. I also feel like the cast shadow behind the tree isn't dark or warm enough. So here I'm adding a muted red mixture which has a lot of vermilion, and I'm going to be very careful to paint around the light rays. After this part is darkened, now the pathway looks too light compared to everything else, so I'm also going to darken the surrounding area with the same color. So that's basically it for this painting, but lastly I just want to show you a comparison between my quick trial and this painting that we just did. Obviously in the final painting it's much neater and more detailed, and I quite like the textures as well as the backlit effect on the flowers. However, even though I've painted the trial faster with less finesse, I feel like I'm drawn to the top portion more because of the contrast in the value between the soft colored sky and the tree. This is done with compost blue and with a really light consistency. So you can see in the overall composition, the color looks a bit more consistent with each other. It has the warmth that I'm looking for, whereas I feel like there's a slight disconnect between the blue of the sky on this painting versus the warm foreground. I also feel like the blue of the sky ended up looking a bit too overworked and heavy because of the additional layer, but with this said, I still very much enjoyed this painting and learned so much in the process, and I hope you also found this video useful. And if you did, please consider subscribing for more tutorials in the future. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!